Well, let's have a laugh. Yeah? If I really have a laugh, so let's do it tonight, yeah? It's all so serious, isn't it? You know. I think I should stop, Sarah. Is anyone listening?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the AA. Tonight's rather unique event comes about for two reasons, really. One is the communications exhibition that is in the gallery opposite and upstairs in the bar, and showcases a lot of the work done at the AA in media other than architecture, and the kind of collaborations that are possible with practitioners in those media. The other reason is the recent issue of AA Files, number 48. We covered a collaboration between Antoni Malinowski, who's an artist and painter who's sitting there with a shaved head in the middle, and Michael Nyman, who's crouching behind the piano, and the architect Peter Wilson on Broadcasting House for the BBC. And in the spirit of this sort of multimedia discussion, we're also joined by Sarah Sahandi, who's a composer and musician herself. And the discussion tonight is going to be chaired by Pascal Schoening. Welcome them all.
Good evening. I want to kickstart this event by saying a few things about color. When it comes to symbolism of color, I'm very skeptical about any theories trying to prescribe meaning to color. We live in a multicultural world where color means different things to different groups of people. Also, within the mainstream European culture, the meaning, for example, of color red shifted in the last, say, 2,000 years or so, shifted from meaning death. In fact, red was a color associated with death since Neolithic times, and at some point in history it began to mean love. So maybe some may say those two things are closely related. However, another tired argument concerns psychology of color. The only reasonable explanation I found about this issue was in a wonderful book called Venetian Color by Paul Hills, who is sitting there. And certain qualities of illumination, like radiant sky near sunset, produce feeling of content and promise that all is right with the world. Well, by using a particular range of colors throughout the city, a very warm, beautiful colors, the Venetians extended that promise and with color reinforced the myth of the Serene Republic both for the citizens and the visitors. So when we see color, we see light hitting the surface and triggering the play of electrons. What we see as colored surface is a mixture of additive and subtractive colors. I shall focus on the subtractive color because that's what concerns me as a painter. Subtractive color is pigments, and here we see tip of an index index finger in one of Tiepolo's paintings. Several layers of paint are involved to produce this particular color, and each layer is made of different substances. For example, the top layer is a mixture of lead white and vermilion and some red earth, and underneath that is black earth peppered with some ivory black, and all this happens on the layer of very warm earth. And when I see such photographs, I'm always reminded of some geological strata or close-ups of medical images, bits of flesh. And this is because the molecular structure of pigments relates to our own molecular structures of our makeup. And so I'm talking about materiality of color and bodily experience. Added light can change color, but subtractive color provides 3D structure of color. We are living in a strange world where, although we are surrounded and bombarded with color all the time, the materiality of it is reduced to very few substances and pigments. This is to do with the commercial paint manufacturing, and which takes titanium white as a base for most paints, and then this base is tinted with dyes which don't change molecular structure, so it all kind of looks very similar. And it is a kind of flavored tofu of the visual world, which now spreads itself on probably 80% of what you see every day, from emulsion painted walls to cars, fridges, lampposts and post boxes. It tries to uniform everything. Titanium white has a very boring molecular structure, and it provides a kind of grayish tone. However, it is very cheap, and it has a great covering capacity. And yet, different pigments produce different kind of luminosity and reflectivity. They can help to achieve the right contrast and the right tone. They can also give required saturation and the right pitch, and also a modulation. So, however, when we talk about color, it's not only pigments but also applications. So, in my case, brush strokes. Brushes determine the size and shape of a brush determines movement and speed, and rhythms of brush strokes are like rhythms of different tempi. Brush strokes fold time, so fold the fourth dimension onto the two-dimensional surface. All those thoughts were going through my mind when on the scaffolding at the magnificent Boris Wilson Luxor Theatre in Rotterdam last year. And now I'd like to show a short video documentation of the event which happened a year ago when Michael Nyman's musicians interacted with the wonderful Boris Wilson architecture and with my work. Thank you.
Okay, Richard MacCormac, please.
There's obviously a long history of theories and collaborative relationships between painting and architecture and music, which is the subject. And I'm not going to sort of delve into the history now. I hope that in a pertinent kind of way, and that'll emerge during our discussions. I thought it would be more helpful if I hope very briefly show some projects which I hope are pertinent to the discussion that we're going to have. So if I could have the first two slides, please, and the lights down. First, I'm going to make a number of points, really, I hope, which are jumping around, because there isn't really, I don't think there are any consistent theories in this area at the moment. There probably haven't been since the Renaissance, really. But one interesting thing is the relationship between, say, Venetian music in St. Mark's, that period, and the evolution of another kind of music, post-Reformation music, in Northern Europe, where the reverberation time of theatres and churches is very short, and of course it allows a music that's never been heard before, which is a precise kind of music of composers like Bach, who require a very short reverberation time. So there is there, I think, a very real connection between architectural space and musical structure. Next. This is a chapel that we did in Cambridge for Fitzwilliam College, which has a short reverberation time and an organ very carefully integrated into the space. So the first reflections are in the narrow part of the building, and then the reverberation is in the circular part of the building. Next. Another unbuilt chapel for Tunbridge School, which suffered the carbuncle effect of the 1980s and didn't get planning permission, which would have had a longer reverberation time and some very interesting acoustic properties. It would have had spaces for musicians and choirs at high level on the galleries, and might have behaved in a rather similar way to St. Mark's, perhaps. Next. I think there's another way one might equate or think about music and architecture, the two enveloping arts. The word volume applies to both. The arts create an environment in which you are, as it were, contained, and in a literal sense, the Philharmonie concert hall by Sharoon on the left is about that, and the volume and quality of the space is very extraordinary, and in a sense, in itself, highly declamatory. And on the right, the big reading room in the British Library, which is not a musical room, but I think has the quality of declamatory volume, as other great spaces in that building have. So I think there's a kind of equivalence there. Next. The next point I want to sort of put on the agenda, as it were, is that on the whole in architectural criticism, the notion that the experience of buildings is a narrative in time is not explored very much. And about, whenever, 3 or 4 years ago now, we finished an underground station for the Jubilee Line extension, which is Southwark Station, which happens to serve Tate Modern. And we always thought of this station and the way we designed it as a kind of narrative journey, which has, simplistically speaking, quite large volumetric, declamatory kinds of spaces, and then passages, and we might use the term in a physical architectural sense, but perhaps there are another kind of passage by a musical analogy as well, which make connections with the primary spaces. So on the left is the ticket hall, and then beyond that you start to go down escalators. Next pair, please. And you arrive in an underground space, which is very big volume, very surprising. You're underground, you're 20 meters underground, and yet you're daylit, and that's it's a big volume, it's a big sound, if you like. Next. And then from that, you, on the left, you go down to the running tunnels, or coming up, you have this strange, rather eerie experience of wondering what space you're going to go into. Next. And what you don't tell project managers when you're doing a project of this kind is it might just have something to do with Schinkel's stage set for the Magic Flute, for the setting of the Queen of the Night, because you probably get a remark, a sort of reaction like, well, I've got the right one here. But it probably did, and what was absolutely extraordinary was when we found that the London Sinfonietta wanted to use the space for concerts on Sunday afternoons, which was just an amazing thing. Next, please. These are two early images, computer images, obviously, of the Science Museum project, the Welcome Wing. And right from the beginning, there are other sketches which I haven't got here. I had this sense that I wanted to suspend the exhibition areas, which are kind of floors that are suspended on gerberettes, in a big blue space. Now, I don't know. People ask me why it's blue. Maybe this question that Antoni raised about the significance of colours, the psychology of colours, is obviously incredibly interesting one. I suppose Yves Klein, particularly painting the Yves Klein, which is called Day Before One, which I think is in Zurich, has always been in my mind. And the other thing that was in my mind occasionally when thinking about this was the final paragraph of Conrad's short story Youth, where the young man survives shipwreck and fire at sea and wakes up somewhere in the east, and he wakes and he sees blueness, he sees blue sky and blue sea, and I don't know what that means. I think it's blue maybe in that context is about infinite possibility. I can't imagine this building being red. Next. And that's the building, which is a blue space where the colour and the way it's actually achieved is intended to kind of dematerialise the space. Working with Antoni now on the BBC, I think we're both committed to the absolutely opposite, largely opposite idea in the interiors, that actually colour has a materiality. It actually informs a sense of the physical presence of construction, which is the opposite to what we try to do here. Next. On the left is the top floor. There's a blue window. I don't know if it is the biggest blue window in the world, but it's 33 meters square. Next. And these are external images of BBC project. Next. And this is a physical model of the space behind All Souls, where we are contrasting the idea of immateriality, rather like the Science Museum, by a fritted and etched solar facade, with the materiality of the stone construction of Broadcasting House and of a new piece which sits opposite Broadcasting House behind the church. Next. The idea is to light and to use the way in which internal lighting begins to make the building transparent after twilight. Again, for some reason, there is a blue wall of glass 8 stories high, which appears at night and might, in a way, create the sense that the building has evaporated at night. You're already seeing the sky through this facade. Next. These are the pre-Antoni Malinowski interiors. And as I say, I haven't got images yet. In fact, we'd love you to make a return visit when we have, but we'll perhaps discuss that in a few minutes. Next. Next. And finally, a lot of the culture of modernism in which I was kind of educated, if you like, and the continuing culture of the white cube in art galleries is chromophobic, to quote David Batchelor's, the title of David Batchelor's book. I am not chromophobic, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And this is an exhibition that I did at Tate Modern about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, called Surrealism, Desire Unbound, where I did try to use colour in a way of creating a narrative around the subject. And these are just, I have 4 images which I'm not going to describe. Next. So that's sort of somewhere of where I've kind of been, and that's all I'm going to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So I tried to start the discussion. Antoni Malinowski and Michel Petters asked me to share this discussion somehow. I don't know why, because I'm not a painter, I'm not a musician, a composer, whatever. I'm not anymore really an architect. So there must be something funny to ask.
Well, yeah.
So, right. I mean, all what I can do is trying to provoke, which hopefully leads to a kind of discussion. When I think of music and the arts, and let's say like Baroque architecture, I have something in mind which has to do with fluidity, with continuity, which in painting, the shapes and the color changes and light is doing in music, the notes and the rhythms and the dynamic which brings it forwards. In ancient architecture, like I mentioned the Baroque, it's done by sign spaces, openings, and you're slowly guided from one space to the other, irritated, and until you are in the apsis and you are there where you should be, and a certain light highlights the crucifix or whatever. In modern or modernist architecture, that has all, I think, or mostly gone, and is replaced by functionality in general, or by signs, exit this way, and so on. There's no real guidance anymore. It's very nice to see, like you tried with colors and with light and narrative. The first time that I hear an architect taking the word narrative in the mouth, I thank you for that. So if one thinks of the fluidity, continuity, the transcendency and immateriality, which is very important for the arts. So I will ask you first, because I'm in the field I'm maybe most at home somehow is architecture, is the continuity, the immateriality. How can one do that in architecture, or how can one revive that? And does one need the arts, or are the arts applied in the use of architecture, like in a way like in the Wilson building? I mean, without your paintings, and the delicate guidance, or without Michael Nyman's music, there, would you really have that fluidity, this continuity which guides you from one space to another? So there are several questions included. There's one, the first question about the continuity and
But you also said something very interesting about modern architecture, and it just happens that in this month's Architecture Today I've written a piece about where British, and I say British architects of my generation have come from. I don't want to go on about it, but you're quite right. There was a kind of game about, well, it's more serious than a game. There was a kind of imposition, which had a lot to do with state socialism, actually, on what architecture was supposed to be about. And in the 60s, you did not talk aesthetics, unless you were archigram, and you avoided it. And I think there's a real change that's happened. And actually, I don't think I was ever part of that British modernism anyway. Actually, my mentor, one of my mentors, was Colin Rowe, who was certainly not part of it. So the kind of matters that you're referring to, narrative, what colour may do, it hasn't always been as important to me as it is now. And working with artists is also symptomatic of this change in the culture of architecture, of trying to find what architecture can say beyond what it's been saying as a functional, in the functional tradition. That's a very big quest at the moment, and I think that's why there's a kind of a real crossover going on at the moment between architects and artists and architecture and art.
Yes, I think somehow that there are different modes of perception, and one which architects use concerns volume very much and form, and then very often they forget that there are all those other modes of perception which human beings actually have, and when they experience buildings, they don't necessarily want to look at a very boring wall and surface which they are confronted with. So, here we go. I'm a great admirer of Peter Wilson's architecture, and I think Luxor is a great building. However, I was called there to deal with a very large wall, which, yes, looked wonderful in, if you like, sculptural terms, but for people who go there every evening to be in that space and as a foyer, it was rather bleak, I would say. So, however, it was red already, but it was a wrong red. So, wrong molecular structure. So I had to correct it with some, my pigments and interacted with it. So it provides a reflection to the spectacular view through the windows, and somehow, yes, maybe provides a spatial continuity indeed between the outside and the inside, and leads the viewer and the person experiencing the space somehow to other areas of the building. I don't know, that's my feeling.
May I also ask Michael Nyman? With the music you composed for the Luxor, did you have that feeling that your intentions in music are okay with the building and with Antoni's color exercises?
I am here. This proves it. it's very interesting seeing that film because I've not seen it before. I was interested more in the accidental than in the intentional. When I first went to the building and Antoni was painting his mural, the mural reminded me a bit of a kind of 1960s graphic score, Cornelius Carde's treatise. There were lines and there were gaps between the lines and directions and sweeps and curves and whatever. And my instinctive reaction was to say that I could put a bunch of musicians in front of this work and they would treat it as a musical score. And then I started to sort of dramatize the positioning of the musicians. You notice that they started off outside of the building on that gallery came into the building, and it felt very much again like a sort of early 70s, late 60s project in the sense that I didn't write any music for those musicians, the brass musicians. I just said, you can treat this mural as a score if you like, just improvise. And that's the disturbing bit, because it's very interesting watching that when you tell a musician who isn't an improviser to improvise, these are kind of orchestral musicians. When you tell them to improvise, they basically play the sounds of improvisation, which actually have nothing to do with music, really. Although Sarah and I will disprove this point later. Those that know what they're doing know how to improvise. And I find that sort of quite painful. And I disclaim any responsibility. For it. Except, and it's sort of interesting that these players have been playing my music for like 10, 15 years. And you would have thought, at least I would have thought, or I didn't think, that they would have tried to play something like what they usually play when they're in my ensemble. And in fact, only the trombone player, I've just noticed, played anything that I'd written, which was... And that's all. Otherwise, it was pretty incoherent. Now, so we had a room of incoherence and a room of coherence, which was a string quartet playing a score that I'd written for string quartet. So they knew what they were doing. I was sort of totally responsible for that piece. And what I said to the brass players was start off by playing, I suppose, I said play anything. And they did play anything. And the room where they started, I don't know, was it the west or the east? I can't remember, maybe the north or the south. They were obviously kind of too far away from the string quartet who were playing all the way through. And also because they were brass players, they were playing loud, so they wouldn't hear what the string quartet were playing anyway. And I instructed them to proceed, move towards the side of the building where the string quartet was playing, and as they got closer to the string quartet, they should actually listen. Again, this is a kind of 60s Cardew or Christian Wolff sort of concept. They should listen to what they were hearing, and then adjust what they were playing to what they heard the string quartet playing, which was what I'd written. So in a way, it was a sort of strange kind of training schedule. Play anything you like, and then as you get closer, you're more and more, I hope, conditioned by what you hear, to play something that I had written for Antoni for another project. And so that was the kind of musical logic of the piece. So when you hear the string quartet, you also hear the brass players, I think, playing better music, because they're suddenly confronted with a model, with an image, where they can't just play any ideas or no ideas, rather, that come into their heads. Excuse me. I don't think any of the players are in this room. But then the more exciting aspect of it was that the accidental part of it was that in charting this kind of this musical progress from incoherence to coherence, from make it up as you go along to adjust what you're playing to just what you're playing to what you hear. I discovered accidentally, although I should have worked it out beforehand, that I was actually articulating the space, and so there was this kind of Pied Piper sensation whereby all the visitors, all the spectators who had been in the bar where the brass were, obviously followed the musicians. So it was a kind of Pied Piper effect, tracking them across the whole of the building from, one side to another, from one window to another, following the musicians and then putting them in front of the piece of music that I'd actually composed as a kind of deliberate act. And I found that absolutely thrilling, that I, musically articulated the space and kind of, allowed people to discover that space because I was discovering at the same time. So, as I say, I was more interested in the kind of accidental consequences of what I'd done than the kind of deliberations of what I'd done.
Now, I think, as far as I can see, that the collaboration between you and Antoni worked very well. And when I said about your paintings, that wasn't meant discriminating, as you know me, just a bit provocative. And but the question is, like, when you look at that video, the camera is moving all the time. So in a way it takes the position of the viewer like in cinema, except that the viewer is not moving, but the image is moving. And it's the most difficult thing, I think, in cinema, to hold the camera and not move the camera. But so it was going along the walls, through the rooms, flipping backwards and upwards and outside and inside and so. So that is not the original thing how you perceive it. At the same time, with the music, the musicians were walking and from space to space. So the question behind that is, okay, I know you play with light, you play with color changes and spatiality in the paintings, and Michael Nyman has done so much composition which are applied, like for films or whatever. I wonder whether it is possible, a collaboration between architect, painter, artist, and musicians to formulate that from the beginning in another way, where instead of having to say this is the auditorium and this is the reception or whatever, or to have, like with the paintings, it's permanent or relatively permanent for time, and but the music was only once. So, like, would it be good if the architect, the painter, and the musician worked together and do like in the Baroque, where it of course was very heavy and overwhelming, and a kind of immaterialized guidance, like the music would be always there and would stop somewhere or appear somewhere else, and then light comes in and would guide you somewhere, and so also the architecture has to change then, of course, yeah.
Well, yeah, gosh, well,
Sorry.
this kind of area was an area that Scriabin was really interested in, and he was he was a composer Russian composer who had very developed theories about the relationship between colour and music. And he wrote a symphony which was played in, I think in New York in 1915, called the Prometheus Symphony. And to accompany the symphony, there was an instrument which was a colour console. It was like a piano, but it didn't make sound, it made coloured light. And it did this on a very large scale, as in a theatre, a series of scrims, which were coloured, presumably by reflection, from a score. I don't think it was. I didn't sure whether Scriabin was then still alive, but this was not his device. It was somebody else interpreting his ideas. So in a way, maybe we're talking. I think it's a very interesting area because it's somewhere in the boundaries of the theatre is the word that comes to mind, actually. And I suppose the question is, could architecture be more like theatre? And I would have thought that's very, very likely, actually, in the world that we're in now. It's certainly implicit in means by which we are able to represent architecture on screen. And obviously virtual architecture can do what we're talking about. The question is, can actual architecture have quality of virtual architecture? In a way, in the Science Museum project, in a rather primitive way, because those walls are scrim, and they're capable of taking projection and so on. It's a very primitive theatrical device, but maybe there are more sophisticated ways of doing it.
I think it's an interesting point there. I was thinking about it when working at the Royal Court Theatre for, the Howard Duncan's refurbishment. And what came to my mind was meeting of three different creative moments. Each discipline has a different timing with the creative moments. So with architecture, it happens very much at the beginning in terms of design. I'm generally speaking, kind of, yes. Then with the work I do, it happens at the moment of actually making it. However, then it is removed from me, and it can be experienced later. And with theater, it happens, or with music, it happens at the very moment. So you have those three different layers, time layers, which can work extremely well and should be.
Mm. I think you could also possibly, if you never thought about it, but you could use music as a means of kind of colouring a room. So you could have this room here with 5 different pieces of music, which you could do kind of instantaneously in a way that would take Antoni at least 3 days to redo. And use that as a kind of way of kind of subjectively guiding people's perceptions to see the space differently. I don't know whether it's been done.
Hockney did this with Gardner in the States in the late 80s. And he did it with, Tristan. And he did it with, it's Turandot. Mm-hmm. And the sets were paintings of light. And they weren't perspectives, they weren't conventional sets. They were in very, very powerful light paintings that changed quite slowly, I gather, through the performances. This is in John Gage's Colour and Culture.
The art of colour and meaning.
I've got
meaning with no culture.
Did you just want to show the book, or did you quote something out?
No, I was going to do readings. I was going to do random readings from the book, but I haven't started.
If you want to read at the end, no, don't want to. No.
Well, I will.
And anyway, I'm originally German from Berlin, and of course in the culture after the Second World War, we were somehow educated in a way of thinking about Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, where all expressive elements are equally handled and not one guided, let's say, by architecture, and I give you, artist, a little commission, or you, musician, just do a little piece of music or whatever. So that is, from the beginning, a collaboration starts, or even architecture will be developed out of the communication with the artist and not the other way around. I mean, we all know that functions are the easiest thing to put into materialized spaces, whether the toilet is there or there. In the end, as long as you can reach it somehow, or whatever, you know, it's not a question. It's not a question. I mean, we have that problem as architect with the materiality, which seems always in the way. But even there are ways, not like Crouching Tiger or so, but where it changes towards lighter materials or tricks which help to see, and you do it with color and light, and so. But like your floors in the welcome wing of the Science Museum, they still are very heavy, you know. You suspended them, that is already a step.
They're kind of diaphanous, you know, they don't express weight, they express buoyancy, actually. Can I go back to something Michael said about the sort of accidental quality? Because I think one of the things that's interesting, and it relates to what you just said about the kind of total work of art and the how, you know, the kind of feasibility of that. And I think it's a very controversial topic, because actually making a building work like the redevelopment of the BBC is actually not very easy. It's technically a very complex task. But I think there is a really interesting subject here, which is for architects, which is you know, how do you work with somebody who actually does have either a leading role or a highly influential effect on what you're doing. And there's another word for accident, perhaps, which is the happy accident, which is serendipity, which is where, in fact, something happens in the process that you hadn't expected, and it's caused by somebody else. And I suggest I'm talking about artist or maybe a musician, and the designer doesn't only accept that effect, but actually sees that the consequence is to produce something, a meaning, which he or she could never have imagined generating themselves. And I think this is an incredibly important possibility. I've been bullied by somebody in this room into working with artists over a long period, who's sitting just over there. And it was quite reluctant, because, again, I think there's a generation of architects, and I'm not going to mention their names, but I think it's rather easy to think who they are, you know, who wouldn't work with artists, because they're losing control. And that's a really big, I think it's a really important psychological issue. I've said enough. It's supposed to be terribly provocative.
Michael Nyman, if you want to add something.
I mean, I think composers are lucky because of performance, and performance only happens once but many times if you're lucky. As with the Luxor, accidents, whether happy accidents, serendipity or not, can happen. But I would kind of venture to think that a kind of major piece of architecture is less prone to kind of accidental re-evaluation or misuse than a piece of music. I mean, Richard talked about reverberation time, which I think is very interesting from composer. 1985, I was invited to write a piece for a huge turbine hall by the Seine, and I went to see it and discovered that it was full of these kind of wonderful objects that had been, that had been turbines before, I guess, France went nuclear. And reverberation time was extremely long, so I realized I had to write a piece for my kind of amplified musicians that was very slow, because obviously if there were a lot of kind of chord changes that happened very fast, as they generally did in my music, there would be confusion, etc., etc., etc. So I sat down and in a very abstract sense started writing a piece of music that I thought would suit the reverberation time in this electricity generating station. And I was in the middle of writing this piece, and I sat down one Wednesday evening in front of the television to watch a football match, and it was between Liverpool and Juventus. And 40 Juventus fans were killed, and I was so kind of affected and involved in this in this football match and the consequences of it, that the piece of music that I've been writing as a purely abstract kind of sonic narrative adventure suddenly took on a kind of emotional character that then became intimately associated with that terrible event, and the emotional charge of the music suddenly had a very strong and specific purpose, which it hadn't had before the match, because before the match I was just writing notes for certain instruments to be performed at a certain pace and a certain space, which had a certain reverberation time, which caused me to write slow music in the first place. Now, I can't think of a building where that kind of reuse or misunderstanding or kind of cycling of space, volume, and emotional effect exists. And I love to think that a building could be made that constantly changes character in the way that piece of music did, or changed purpose.
Yes, but what happened was the kind of tragedy at the match presumably occurred in a fairly timely way. We got so far. I could imagine a similar thing happening in the designing of the building. Not similar actually, because I think the capacity for, this is another kind of interesting area of discussion, what's the emotional capacity of architecture? Actually, there was a treatise in the middle of the 18th century, which Sir John Soane was very interested in, which was about the emotions of architecture, which I have to say I haven't read. The Soane Museum has a copy of it. But I suppose in the case of the Science Museum, I was consciously aware of two recent exhibitions, relatively recent exhibitions, at the Haywood. One was Eve Klein and the other was James Turrell. And the building probably, you can't ever know what honestly what effects things have, but I suspect that it wouldn't have come out like that without those two recent exhibitions. That's the nearest I can get to what you've been talking about.
Antoni?
Come on, everyone's got something to say.
How would you see yourself, Antoni, if you would be in the position, let's say, like an architect is in the position, or a filmmaker is in a position to say you do the music or you do the painting, when it would be reversed, and you could give the guidelines how the architect and maybe even composer should work?
Well, I wouldn't dare to tell an architect, what they should design or what the composers
I don't know
compose. But I can contribute something in terms of visualization of color in space, because this is my field. So by working for many years with color, I can visualize something which perhaps people who don't work with it on every day cannot see. And so, for example, in the recent project with Richard, the BBC broadcasting house, there is this very, very large and prominent tower at the very center of the building. And when we started talking about my involvement, somehow I noticed that it was very monochromatic and kind of rather dull, perhaps. And I immediately saw the potential for this shape, for this architectural form to be articulated and reinforced with really strong color, but it has to be right. So this is what I do, and somehow I of course then search for the right, not only I don't only specify some stuff color in the chart, but I also search for a paint and so pigment, because as I was trying to say, color is materiality, it is vibration and reverberation, because this is what happens. And here it actually relates to music, because
I'd like to sort of do the reflective story, as it were. And what we've done is we got consent from English Heritage, because it's a listed Grade 2 star building, to demolish all the rooms to the north of the studio tower and Broadcasting House. Broadcasting House, in the 1932 Architectural Review, was called the Second Tower of London, and that was because of this idea of embedding the studios in a 6-story tower in the middle to protect them from traffic noise. And in the 1928 design, that tower appeared out of the top and was visible. The idea was visible. Then it's got lost, really. And then we got consent to demolish the rooms to the north, so you actually have this huge tower visible in an atrium in which we're putting another tower, little round tower. And what Antoni did was to somehow, what's the word really? I mean, by paint, can I allowed to say what colour it's going to be? Molecular. It's going to be vermilion. And so there's this huge vermilion object in sort of embedded and somehow embodied, and the vermilion will give it a material presence which will be absolutely extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Because it then relates to light in a very specific way. That kind of red becomes extremely bright when you light it when you give it lots of light. It can become very dark when you remove the light. So it is it has then potential of of being this live creature at the very
Heart of the
center
building.
and the heart of the building. So,
And it's where broadcasting is made inside this great red object, our studios, and that which we're rebuilding. And so this red object is this kind of key object in the plays.
and of course, when I think about color in this way, I try to consider almost like, I don't know whether it's called in music a tonality. So what kind of tonality does it keep? Because it's, no, this tonality? I don't know. Whether it's, B major or B minor.
This is interesting because it was a recording studio where music is kind of contained inside. Music is contained inside this recording studio, sealed acoustic objects. So could you conceive of a music outside of the recording studios, which again kind of articulates the space rather as we did with the Luxor? It's a kind of strange paradox. You have music sounding outside an acoustic space which is supposed to be totally isolated from any exterior sound in which music is produced.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about that is whether in this project, where the circulation system in the project, use a sort of architectic jargon, the way you move around allows you to understand the building, and generally speaking, perhaps not in the kind of redevelopment of broadcasting house, but in other parts of the scheme, the circulation is social space. It's where you meet, and the circulation spaces are we call them the thoroughfares and high streets, and they're connected vertically by open staircases, which is very, very unusual because of fire regulations. Now I can imagine a piece of music that is written for all of this space, all of it. And it could be that the music can only be heard as a totality from outside the building. It's a tall building, it's 8 stories high. 9 stories, but eight stories of production space. And so there could conceivably be a different piece of music written for every thoroughfare, every level. And then maybe the musicians make their promenade, their journeys, like they did in Luxor. And somehow the musical events at each level become conjoined in some way, and then maybe broadcast in summer to the place behind the church, which is conceived as an open air performance area. So there is a kind of possible tie-up here. Except it's blue, of course it's a problem.
Yeah, but of course I'm looking for something which is planned from the beginning. Sorry?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you a question. Do you imagine I work in the area of sampling sound, and as well as playing this instrument, I work with sound, and I'm just wondering, thinking of sound, every building has a sound, or there's a sound, or thinking of the blurring of the boundary between music and sound. Can you imagine a piece of music that was a sound that lived permanently, rather like a red colour, somewhere in a building?
Interesting. I think I can actually, but you'll have to do it to persuade me. It's like in the Cherry Orchard, in sort of production of Chekhov. There's strange sounds start, don't they? I mean, the Three Sisters that's on the moment at the National.
It could be a sound. It could be a sound. It could be a piece of music. Score. I mean, I don't know where you draw the distinction between sound and music. For me, that's a big question.
Well, I mean, there are people have used buildings or Ron Arad did a sound staircase ages ago, like sort of, gosh, more than 20 years ago, which you activated by being on the staircase, and in the side aisles of the Science Museum, which I didn't show images of, I had an idea it never got accomplished, that the movement of people up and down those staircases to get to the floors would actually trigger music that would never be the same, because it would always be related to the different patterns of presence in the space. So that was, yes, I'm trying to respond to your thing. The idea was it was permanently full of sound that was reconfigured all the time in relation to how the space was being used. But that never got off the ground. I talked to Brian Eno about it, but the Science Museum couldn't do it.
Michael Nyman.
Yeah, that's me.
Sorry. I mean, when you do music compositions for film, I mean, you have to imagine enormous event spaces, I would call it. So between the physical appearance and the action in that, I just want to know, or to ask you, is how much spatial do you think when you compose that? You don't have to think.
I can only think when I'm sitting down. But I can also sit when I'm not thinking. It's not a very pleasant occupation, writing film music, seriously. Especially with more conventional narrative films where you're not dealing with anything kind of elemental. You're really dealing with, kind of filling in emotions, giving emotional information. You're not giving spatial information. You're not even giving kind of conceptual information. With the Greenaway films, it was much better, because since they were kind of empty of emotion and they only dealt with concepts and spaces, it was possible to write a music which articulated those concepts in those spaces, and in addition, a bit like my piece for the turbine hall, kind of provided emotion. But the emotional thing, as with the turbine hall piece, was kind of accidental. Again, the happy accident. And also the other thing that film music can do and should do is to provide motion as distinct from emotion. And again, in the kind of fairly conventional films that I've written for recently, of which one is on the television tonight, Carrington, apparently, you're not really given the opportunity to do anything that needs a kind of brain.
But
you try to use your brain to do the kind of emotional work that you're basically asked to do.
So do you get a lot of corrections or remarks from the directors?
Yeah, I mean,
constantly.
I mean, and the last film I did, corrections and rewrites and replacements, and I mean, I think if I'd been an architect, I would have kind of pulled out of the job and said, well, why don't you get your instructions right? Tell me what building you want, and tell me what you wanted to do, and I'll try and, fulfill the brief. But it kind of kept changing. The other thing is that music is so peculiar in the sense that the only thing that explains music and explains the effect of music is the music. And it's only when the director hears the music that he or she, in this case it was a she, but it doesn't really matter, realized that it was the wrong music. So it's like, I suppose, a client sort of asking you an architect to create a sort of particular volume, and it's only once you're in the space that you realize it's wonderful or inadequate. But fortunately, writing the film music, you have 3 weeks rather than sort of 3 years to get it wrong. And you can kind of erase the wrongness very easily. With a building, it's rather more difficult.
but that's rather interesting to me, because I think, I wonder whether explaining buildings using words, which we have to do a lot, isn't a relatively modern phenomenon, that we're not a society that is able to cope very easily with the medium of architecture. And because music really can't be explained except in its own medium, you're actually, as it were, the medium sort of protects you from this, I think, quite modern thing, where you have to invent ways of describing something that actually, if it's really good, can't be described at all adequately. But we're in a verbal and a society that's all about what's measurable, and so there's a tendency for us to keep having to resort to forms of accountability, which are very, very primitive, actually. And you're quite lucky in a way.
Yeah, well, I think
they can't come out and tell you really much about it, except unless they're very trained. They just come out. If it's been great, they come out feeling very happy, and it hasn't been. They're not so happy, and that should be the case with buildings. But there are all kinds of intermediate sort of ways in which we have to kind of talk, particularly in the public sector, of course, of accountability. You see,
Right.
BBC's product is not measurable. Am I right? I mean, in a sense, that's what's so interesting with BBC, because it's a product, which is just a wonderful product. You can't sit down and add it up. Whereas in the case of hospitals, and the efficiency of a hospital, turnover of patients or whatever, is highly quantifiable. You have to listen to your viewers, yeah. But, yeah.
No, but it is that, at the end of the day, it's when it is fully accounted.
Yes, but it's an accountability that can't be quantified in a primitive way.
But there is a finite amount of money to the extent of programming or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There is that accountability issue.
Turn it on the box.
Wait, I give it to you.
Yes, hats on there. You tell I work at the BBC. Yes, BBC has to be accountable in terms of its number of viewers, number of listeners. Those are very crude measures, obviously. That's one of the measures that's then used to compare us with the commercial sector. And then, if the BBC is too successful, we can't why it's not doing what the commercial sector isn't doing. So you are on this tightrope as you are there.
But I mean, maybe one of the problems with buildings is people, and maybe one of the problems with National Health Service is people. So you could make a wonderful building that should do the job and should lead staff and even patients to do their job better. But
But there's a kind of, I don't want to get too embroiled in this one because it is quite complicated. Buildings do have to be socially responsible and accountable. But I read a few months ago that there'd been a strange kind of experiment with different classical composers' music being played as a kind of slightly horrible thought, in a way anyway, but as a background to very young children having lessons in numeracy and mathematics, and how it appeared quite definite, quite certain that Mozart was the composer who had the most beneficial effect. You can just see, can't you, the DCMS suddenly waking up and saying, gosh, this chap Mozart's useful after all.
Pascal, we've heard a lot of words, but no music.
Yes.
Yeah.
you weren't listening at the beginning, or maybe you don't call it music.
Michael, do you want to play Sarah?
Yes. Why don't we? Yeah. Excuse me. As I go to play, I am allowed to touch the piano. you're allowed to.
Thank you very much. I hope in future the collaboration or influence and intuition of the different fields between music, art and architecture will become much more intensive and really influence each other. There are possibilities because all are thinking spatially. So thank you very much for being here.
Beautiful. We did so well. I came to the right ending. What was she
So we are going to dinner together.